Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's discussion of what is arguably one of Martin Scorsese's most underrated movies and is certainly one of his least seen movies, The King of Comedy, which was suggested to us. And I know I appreciate that it was suggested to us. We'll see if you all do, by my co-moderator this evening, Lisa DeNight. Lisa, how are you?
Doing great. How about yourself, Andrew?
Fine, and I was so glad to have the opportunity to revisit this movie, and I'm sure we'll hear from other folks what they thought, and maybe I'll have a chance to share why I was glad to have the chance to see it again. But before we get to that, let's cover our ground rules a little bit. For those of you who are new to this, please keep your audio on mute until I call on you. I will know to call on you because you will use the raise hand function shown on your screen there next to the number 2 or below the number 2. And I will see that your hand is raised, at which point I will call on you and in the order your hands appear. And then I would ask you to please unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment. And then please remute yourself while Lisa and or I respond to it. You are certainly welcome to come back with additional hand raisings. I don't know if I'll be able to get to everyone, but I will do my best to get to everyone at least once in the order their hand appears. In addition, we have the chat function active tonight. Our colleague Jill is on that, and you can introduce yourselves to each other, discuss other aspects of the movie with each other, ask questions, and also let us know where you're from. If you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area, and if you're from really far outside the greater Philadelphia area, please visit the Where in the World section of Film Studies Online at brynmarfilm.org and let us know if maybe you're from one of those world cities shown on our map here, or perhaps some other place where we didn't know we had folks tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you and how you found us and so on and so forth. Great. So with that, I believe we can get started tonight. And as usual, first out of the gate, we have David. David, how are you?
I'm well. I hope both of you are, and all of your other listeners. I found this very interesting. I'll use that word in quotes for the moment. That more like a college professor than helping us with entertainment in terms of Lisa's choice. I found the movie somewhat perplexing. I started out not being a fan of Jerry Lewis for sure. As a sort of sideline, I thought his performance as the movie went on, I thought more and more of his performance. But afterwards, I went looking for some outside comments because I was perplexed as the movie went on, and I was perplexed when it was over. I decided to pick Ebert and New York Times as two reviews to read, and they were very different. I had trouble believing they were watching the same film until I realized I was perplexed, and I think they were as well. I had trouble figuring out what Scorsese wanted us to understand as real versus imaginary, and Janice and I didn't actually come to the same conclusion. So I'm going to certainly ask for the two of you to help at least me, maybe us, through the thought process of which of the post-jail scenes probably really happened versus were all in Pumpkin's imagination. Ebert said it was a difficult performance for at least 4 of the actors to deliver. I certainly can agree with that. They used the term emotionally isolated. These were very challenged characters in terms of both the performance and what I think we were viewing. New York Times said it was funny and ended on a high note. I'm tempted to go back and watch it 3 or 4 or 5 more times and see if I can find what they found truly funny and a high note. But I'll leave that as a place for the two of you to start helping guide us through this very interesting and very different movie.
Well, thanks for that, David. And I think if you and Janice were perplexed, then we definitely have our work cut out for us. Lisa and I were talking about what is real and what isn't or what might not be before the discussion started. And I had assumed his mother was real, and Lisa said, "Are you sure?" And now that's been rolling around in my brain for the last 5 minutes. But regarding some sort of clarity about the ending and about the tone of the movie, I'm sure Lisa has some thoughts on that. Lisa.
David, thank you so much for your comments. And if I heard you correctly, you either purposefully said pumpkin or that was a Freudian slip. And I'm so glad you did that.
It was Freudian, and I don't want to apologize because maybe it was the way I came away, but good catch.
That is one of my favorite things in the entire movie. I mean, Rupert Pupkin's best joke is his name, which is just utterly ridiculous. And the panorama of all of the different mispronunciations we get, pumpkin, puffin, like popkin, krupnik, like it's endlessly funny to me. I do laugh at this movie now. I have to say, I cringe, but I also laugh many times. Maybe that's because I've seen it probably more than most people on this call. But you raised some really great points, and certainly it is a perplexing movie in a lot of ways, but that's kind of the fun of it. You can just play it over in your mind and really find as many ways to analyze it and come up with an answer as you want. In terms of what I think is fantasy versus reality. Well, first I'll say I love the way that Scorsese demonstrates the concepts of fantasy and reality with his camera in this film, because they're almost indistinguishable. The fantasy is so real for Rupert, and that is demonstrated in the way that Scorsese kind of renders fantasy sequences. Like clearly there are some parts that we know are fantasy, like when he's talking to Jerry, but it cuts to him in his basement. Clearly this conversation is not happening in reality. But where it does get most interesting is the end, as you say. And I'm gonna kind of refuse to choose a side, because I think what's so beautiful about that ending, especially today, is that it could just as easily be reality as it could be Rupert's fantasy. You know what? I take it back. I will choose a side. I do come down on it being fantasy because Rupert is so obsessed with his name. Like that's just a through line in this film. He is obsessed with it. He wants to own this ridiculous name. And at the very end, when he comes out in front of all the cameras, the announcer type voice is saying, "Rupert Pupkin, everyone, wonderful, Rupert Pupkin," and he just has this repetition over and over again of him, standing in pure audience adulation, hearing his name over and over again. So I do come down on the side of fantasy. But I think the beauty of the ending is that it really could be either.
And it's probably more credible today than it was nearly 40 years ago, which is one of the reasons why I think a lot of critics and scholars consider this film to be underrated, because to me, in this way, it reminds me a little bit, it's very different, but it reminds me a little bit of A Face in the Crowd. You could see how when both of these movies came out, somebody might say to you, "Oh, that's ridiculous." But then 10, 20, 30, 40, in the case of Face in the Crowd, 60 years later, you can't really say that anymore. And in a sense, it's like Network as well. Another New York set movie about the broadcasting world. And so, but I tend to agree with Lisa that the ending is not real. And I agree with it for two reasons. One of them is that point Lisa made about that there's no, we have to, the film is clearer than some in identifying the fantasy elements or fantasy moments within it, but it's not as clear as it might be. So we have to pay attention and think about what's included. And we all know Scorsese's a meticulous filmmaker. So that repetition of, constant reintroduction, re-announcement, there's no reason for that to be there unless it is meant to give us a sense of, again, the interiority, what's going on in Rupert's brain. I also think that we have to think about the tone of the movie overall, and we have to think about calibrate the cynicism of the movie. And I think depending on how you calibrate that will help determine your answer as well. And I can go into that a little bit more just by saying that, I didn't read the New York Times review. It sounds like the person to me totally missed the movie, because for that ending to be an up ending, a happy ending, then we have to believe that Rupert Pupkin is a character that we are supposed to, on the whole, root for. I'm not saying you can't have sympathy for him. You certainly can, and that's part of the design. But for us to believe that he is the quote unquote good guy of the movie, that's the only way that ending, if it really happens, is a quote unquote happy ending. I don't think we are supposed to think that. I don't think the movie wants us to think that, this was a harmless little thing and nobody really got hurt, and that's that. I think, as some critics at the time said, in a way, the movie is a bit more potentially insidious than Taxi Driver, to which it also, makes sense to compare it, because there Travis Bickle screamed dangerous from a mile away. In this movie, Pupkin doesn't, but obviously we see that he is. And so I think those are some of the considerations in that larger question. But the good news is we can talk about it for the next 45 minutes or so if folks are game to. Gene, you had a question or comment.
Yeah, hi Andrew, hi Lisa. Thanks for this film. I've seen it so many times. I just absolutely love it. I just want to make 3 very quick points. One is, I was talking to a friend about 2 weeks ago. He asked me what my favorite type of comedies are. And I said, what I laugh at the most are not films that declare themselves as comedies. They're films where comedic moments happen in something like a drama. And I pointed out both Raging Bull and King of Comedy because I just find the character traits and behaviors even hysterical sometimes. And I just know that they're probably cracking up between takes on some of these, improvised moments and things. But 2 things that always stand out when I watch it are kind of the editor Thelma Schoonmaker and Scorsese's. They have no real strict regard for continuity in this film because they don't let it get in the way of just using the best moments. For you'll see his hand up at his chin in one shot, and then in the next it's down in his lap or something. There's even a scene where he and De Niro and Sandra Bernhard are arguing on the street, and in one shot they're standing still, and in the reverse shot they're walking. And it gives it a certain energy and uncomfortable feeling that really works well for it. And finally, I just love how much attention, or how well they were able to translate the dialogue in some of his fantasies. Well, not translate, but the dialogue in many of his fantasies were so beautifully, the germ of them were so beautifully taken from Rupert's state of mind. The wedding scene, on Jerry's show. You know that every line in that, no matter who was speaking it, was really Rupert's voice. So those are the things that stand out to me the most.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Gene. I'm really glad you brought up the continuity errors, or the gaffes, we might call them, because as you said, Thelma Schoonmaker is a renowned editor, and for a very good reason, and Scorsese is known to be a meticulous filmmaker, but we don't see that here. And I was really, frankly, surprised by some of the poor choices and reverse shots that didn't seem to match, and things like what you said. And I wasn't really sure what to chalk it up to. it seemed to me that this film was shot in a surprisingly guerrilla style when they were on the streets of New York. I was surprised at how many onlookers there were. I was surprised how little the street environment around them seemed to be controlled. It's very easy to account for the onlookers when Jerry Lewis is there because he's supposed to be a famous guy, but when Sandra Bernhard and Robert De Niro are walking down the street, it makes less sense. So I was really surprised by those, and I wasn't sure. The only thing there were two things really I could chalk it up to in my mind, and I have no real sort of basis and knowledge for this. One is I understand there was a time in the 80s when Scorsese had a problem with cocaine, and maybe that had something to do with his focus.
He and Robbie Robertson were living together, and they were both pretty well involved.
So there you go.
Mention real quick, I read that the scene when Jerry's walking down the street and the construction workers high above are shouting down to him, that was not planned. That was a real moment that they took advantage of.
Well, that's one of the great things about shooting in New York. Any filmmaker will tell you. The other thing I was going to say, though, the other thing I chalked it up to is I know that they shot in New York. It was a producer that I don't believe Scorsese had worked with before, who would go on to produce Arnon Milchan would go on to have a long career. But they were working under pressure, I think, of an impending Writers Guild strike or something. So the shoot may have been a little more rushed than would be typical. But that's just speculation on my part. And I did notice those elements you were talking about. Lisa, any thoughts you have on any of Gene's comments?
Gene, I love that you mentioned that little anecdote about the construction workers yelling down. Jerry Lewis actually insisted on his character being called Jerry Langford, so that when he was walking down the streets of New York shooting this film, if people called out, "Hey, Jerry," then, it would be very fitting for the film as well. But yeah, you had some great comments, and I really appreciated Andrew's comments about the continuity as well. And I don't know if it was purposeful, but to me, it also kind of injects some additional uneasiness into the proceedings. You really don't know what Rupert Popkin is going to do next, and I kind of like the additional little mysteries, little oddities, little weird asides in the filmmaking, because the shots are pretty sedate's the wrong word, but for Martin Scorsese, the way that he films this was purposefully more subtle, more flat, and so I kind of liked the little weirdness that you could see in the screen. And certainly it was shot very much guerrilla style on the streets of New York, which also yielded a lot of that. I'm also very glad that you find this funny. I understand that it is not for everyone, but I love the comments about finding comedic moments in films that are not necessarily billed as comedies. One of the funniest moments to me in this entire film is when Rupert is showing Jerry the cue cards, and he can't even get the cue card order right, and Jerry is he's such a consummate professional, like, you can't even get the cue cards right. It's so funny to me. I laugh every time.
I think that we film film aficionados, film critics, film scholars, whatever you want to call people like us, always, I think, tend to make excuses is too strong, but give the credit of intentionality to expert filmmakers or filmmakers we appreciate or respect. And I know people have done it with Hitchcock for years. Sometimes there were poor shots and poor effects and mistakes in Hitchcock films, and you should read the articles trying to explain them. So at the risk of doing that here, I don't want to completely excuse the continuity errors, but what I will say is, and I think this relates to that more stationary and more staid and subdued camera style that Lisa just mentioned and had mentioned in her introduction. This whole movie, and this is probably part of the reason why it didn't connect with audiences at all and only partially connected with critics. This whole movie is trying to keep us at a distance as viewers. And part of the way it does that is we see Rupert, we get the insight that some of what Rupert's imagining is imagination, is fantasy or delusion. But we never get to see at any point in this movie the real Rupert, right? I mean, it's like, it's like in Taxi Driver, you did get to see Travis Bickle by himself and you saw what Travis Bickle was really like, but then you saw him when he was with like Sybil Shepherd, right? This whole movie, we're seeing Rupert with Sybil Shepherd. We're seeing Rupert when he's on the whole time. The closest we get is when he's alone with Sandra Bernhard, but even then, he's posing and fronting and trying to come off as more mature, more erudite, whatever, than he is. And so I think there's a detachment there, and it's part of the reason why my sympathy for him was limited. Is part of the reason why I didn't find his perfectly serviceable stand-up routine to be worthy of laughs. Because there's a distance there. And to that point, I think Scorsese's very good at a dynamic and subjective camera. He doesn't use it here. That helps keep us at a distance. Those mistakes, to the extent people notice them, like, some of us obviously did, those keep us at a distance. So I think there's something going on here about pushing the audience away to an extent, or trying to sort of sabotage or prevent any sort of connection that a filmmaker would usually try to achieve. And I don't know if those were a conscious part of it or a tolerated, accepted part of it. I can't believe they were on purpose, but maybe they were tolerated for that reason. Dana, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do. Hi, guys. Terrific choice. I don't think I'd ever seen this movie. I don't know why or how I missed it, but I did. So this was a real treat for me. And there's so much going on in my head, so many things I want to say. So I'm going to limit it to this. Again, it's so much fun to look at movies in the then and the now, when they were made and what they're like now. So from the very beginning of this movie, I thought Joker. I was thinking of Todd Phillips' Joker. And I thought, wow, I am so smart. Look at that connection. And then, of course, I read and I realized that I'm not the first person who made that connection, but I do want to make that connection. And I want to say that there were so many things about this movie, which in its day may have looked one way, but now having had Joker, and I don't really want to talk about a movie that other people haven't seen, but there are so many similarities between Joaquin Phoenix's horrifying character and Rupert, that Rupert almost seems tame in comparison. The notion of New York is the petri dish for a troubled person, a troubled performer, and what happens. And the notion that this is perhaps the way it could have been perceived, and go down a very dark path in the 80s. But look at how the same perception is now in 2021 or 2020 when Joker was made, and then it becomes not just being tied up with duct tape and so forth. It's a real gun. It's really violent. So I just was amazed by Scorsese's influence. He's obviously incredibly influential on filmmakers. You really can see it on so many levels. I read that when he made this movie, he didn't even want to see it after he made it. I think he's kind of prissy. I think Scorsese's a little bit of a prude. He makes these movies with these subjects that he doesn't really, and he's uncomfortable with them. So that I like that. But again, I'd love you two to talk about that straight line that I see between these two movies, which, I think it's unavoidable and really important. So Lisa, thanks so much. This was great.
Well, thanks very much, Dana. Lisa, do you have anything you want to jump in with?
Dana, I'm so glad you liked it. Andrew and I were kind of talking before this started. Oh, do you think people are going to like this one? And we were kind of mixed. It's an acrid movie. I used that word earlier to describe it with someone else, very acrid. But it has eternal relevance. I mean, the media landscape in 1983 was different, but people remain the same. And that sort of single-minded yet shallow ambition for something pretty hollow is just as relevant in 2021, if not more so than it was in 1983. And yes, I mean, Joker, I would say Joker is and I'm also not the first one to say this, Joker is kind of a 50-50 split between Taxi Driver and King of Comedy, with, maybe a bunch of 2019 era nihilism thrown in for good measure. But yes, very influential, and far beyond Joker too. The particular strain of awkward comedy in this, as I think I mentioned in my intro, has influenced Stephen Merchant and Ricky Gervais with The Office, the British Office, and all manners of. Steve Carell also is a huge fan of this film. So Scorsese and this film, eternally influential. And I must say that I prefer the King of Comedy version of this malcontent than Todd Phillips's 2019 version of this malcontent. But the line is definitely there.
I mean, the connections, are definitely there. I think there's at least one interesting difference, which I'll get to, but I think we, think back to the early 1980s, and I don't know that people used the word stalker then. I certainly know it wasn't as common as it is now. I know that John Hinckley had tried to kill President Reagan, supposedly to impress Jodie Foster, and being some connection there to Taxi Driver. I know Mark David Chapman had shot John Lennon. And I think these were seen as isolated, delusional people who, had problems and fixated on celebrities more so than what would come to pass, and what I think this film implies, which is that the very sort of density and prevalence of celebrity culture can sometimes lead people to be this way. And I think there's a bit of an implication of that take on it in this movie, and that certainly would become much more common as the 80s turns the 90s and on and on. I remember there was that actress who was on television, I think her name was Rebecca Schaefer, who was killed by a fan, and the coverage that got, not just because it was a tragic death, but because the notion that, a fan would go to such lengths to do that. I think Joker has obviously some of that wrapped up into it. I think the celebrity culture and the pervasiveness of it in 2019 versus 1983, there's no comparison. Obviously, there's no internet, no social media, all of that. I think one crucial difference with Joker that makes it much more of its specific time is not only was there the connection to the individual who, seemed to be mentally ill, and his obsession with celebrity, but there was also very much in that movie, particularly at the end, but sprinkled throughout, the notion that he was representative or emblematic of a larger movement, of a larger group of people. And that is something that neither of these two movies that we're talking about, the Scorsese movies, had, but is obviously much more connected to the culture and politics of Joker's time. But yes, definitely connections there. Matt, you have a question or comment?
Yes, thanks, Andrew. This was an excellent choice. I had not seen this film before this weekend, and which is remarkable given how much of a fan of Scorsese and De Niro I am, and but it was a great choice. So thank you for that. I wanted to mention a couple of themes that come through it in the movie for me, which are kind of related. There's kind of a, I'd call it a metaphysical or multi-level set of themes in the movie of serious actors playing comedians and comedians playing serious actors. So Jerry, and they all have talent on both sides of the mask, so to speak, the drama and comedy. But Jerry Lewis is, of course, much better known for being a comic actor, and he's certainly had other movies where he plays serious roles. But essentially in this movie, although he plays a Johnny Carson type character, his character really is very serious, with one notable exception at the end of the kidnapping scene when Sarah Bernhardt cuts him loose, literally, of the tape, and he grabs the gun and points it at her. And by then you kind of know it's a fake gun, and you all but expect when he pulls the trigger that a little flag is going to pop out and say bang. And it's almost like that. But he plays a serious character. And then on Sarah Bernhardt is better known as a comedian, but again, she's playing a comedian in the movie, but who is really a serious character in the movie, given her emotional issues. And then again, the kidnapping scene, I have to believe that when she disrobes and starts coming on to the Jerry Lewis character, that was all entirely ad-libbed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'd be curious to know. But then Robert De Niro, who is better known as being a serious actor, although he has been in comedic movies, here it's so multi-leveled it's hard to keep track. He's a serious actor playing a comedian, but he's not just playing a comedian, he's playing a bad comedian with a serious emotional issues. So his performance in this movie was just fabulous in my view. And then the other theme that runs through this is not unrelated. Remember, all the main characters in this movie are famous people playing in a movie about trying to become famous, or actually having become famous in the case of Jerry Lewis. But fame in this movie is just a completely dysfunctional character trait to acquire. And so the movies by and about famous people and all of the dysfunctions that fame can lead to. So I have other comments, but I'll leave it at that for now. And if there's time, I'll bring up one other point. But I'd appreciate your thoughts on these two themes and kind of metaphysical, multi-level play acting. And then the question about whether Sarah was ad-libbing that scene during the kidnapping section of the movie. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matt. Lisa, do you have any knowledge about what he was asking about the ad-libbing?
Yeah, Matt, thank you for your comments. Those are really great comments. And I'm so glad you brought up the idea of kind of the metatextuality of the actors that are cast in this film. I really look forward to talking about that with Andrew in a bit. But specifically to answer your first question, yes, that scene was entirely ad-libbed, and it was kind of terrifying for Jerry Lewis because he was taped up. And Sandra Bernhard was just completely ad-libbing that scene, disrobing. I mean, he did not know what she was going to do. And that it was just, how could you do it any other way? You have to have that element of absolute like fear and concern.
The look on his face was so genuine of his abject fear of what she was doing. I thought it was all he could do to not start cracking up. But of course, his face was all taped up, so he couldn't laugh if he wanted to. I just imagine the atmosphere on the set while they were making that scene must have been wild.
It was, but maybe not in the way that you hypothesized just now. Jerry Lewis and Sandra Bernhard did not get along, and I mean, Jerry Lewis has since passed, but anytime this film was brought up, practically both of them kind of, beat around the bush somewhat, but did not really have the most pleasant things to say about each other. I think Jerry Lewis was from a different generation who, and this is not my opinion, I think Jerry Lewis expressed this on numerous occasions. He didn't care that much for female comics, so I didn't think that it was befitting for women to be comics, I'll say. And so this scene, when he was confronted with Sandra Bernhard's absolute, ad-libbed frenzy, I mean, it was not easy for him, nor was it really easy for him to work with Robert De Niro, who is such a method actor in this particular film. And he really had a great professional working relationship with Scorsese and De Niro, but Sandra Bernhard, little more of a contentious pairing there on the set, which makes that scene even better, I think. Andrew, I will pass it back to you and we can volley.
Yeah, I mean, the points about the comedy and the serious are interesting. Jerry Lewis, more so than many comedians of his period or movie comedians in general, was known to be very, very serious about his comedy and very, very serious about his movies. And he could be a stern taskmaster as a director, and he reached a point in his career where he had a lot of creative control and a lot of power over how his films were made. I don't want to say that he was sort of Kubrick level intense about it, but he was much closer to Kubrick on the spectrum than, say, Clint Eastwood is as a director. He also was very serious about the craft. In fact, not a lot of people know this, but Jerry Lewis invented video playback. When a film is being shot on film, just like when we all used to take pictures with our cameras on film, you don't know what you've got. You can sort of see what you're getting through the viewfinder, but you don't have nearly as good a sense of it as we all do today when we can look at the picture right away, or we look at on the screen of our phone and we know that that's what the picture is going to look like. Well, the same was true with shooting motion pictures. You had to wait a couple of days to see what you had gotten. And Lewis found that very frustrating. You can imagine for the immediacy of comedy and the spontaneity of comedy, how that could be especially challenging. So he's the one who figured out how to put a tiny camera in the viewfinder of the motion picture camera and somehow siphon that image out and expand it so it could be looked at on a video monitor. And you get a better sense of what you were capturing. And that's a technique that was immediately picked up by filmmakers all over the place. And I only mention this because it shows you how serious he was about his endeavor. On the other hand, someone like Robert De Niro, who has played so many intense and serious and suffering and intimidating and in some cases horrific characters, is, it seems by most accounts, actually a very mild-mannered, sort of relatively easygoing, quiet, personal guy. He is not Max Cady. He is not Al Capone. He is not Travis Bickle. He's not even Jake LaMotta. So, there is that distinction there. I found this movie to, it's always it has the potential to be a little hard to take when you have rich and successful, famous people complaining about some aspects of being famous. And certainly toward the beginning of the film, it's easy to get the sense, it was easy for me to get the sense that Jerry Langford was a bit of an ingrate. But as the movie goes on and you see how genuinely weary he is, and you see how he feels the weight of the ship of his corporation or organization, as the security guard calls it, on his shoulders solely, with good reason, you can understand, that sort of heavy sits the crown. And I think that's probably something Lewis felt for real himself in lots of walks of life, which is what made his performance so good and so credible, is that he could summon those feelings up very immediately. I also can imagine it was not easy for him to be on a movie set where he was not calling the shots as well. So I think you identified some very interesting dynamics, and I think if one thinks about them once they watch the film, it really adds some additional layers.
Andrew, can I add a little bit
Sure.
more onto that?
Sure.
Another thing that I really love about the casting of Jerry Lewis here, even though he wasn't the first choice, Johnny Carson was the first choice for the role, of course. But what I love about the casting of Jerry Lewis is, as Andrew said, he was so serious about his filmmaking craft, but he was serious about playing absolute buffoons, like just absolute idiots. And one thing that I really love about the dynamic between Jerry Lewis and Robert De Niro in this film is that Jerry Lewis is essentially looking at something that could have been one of his creations in one of his movies, just a really demented version of it. Like I love Jerry Lewis's films with Frank Tashlin, where he plays, obsessive, simple-minded men that have, they're obsessed, an artist and models. He's obsessed with the Bat Lady in comics, and Rupert Pupkin could be seen as kind of an alternate universe reality of one of Jerry Lewis's characters. And I think that is so brilliant in this film, especially when you consider that last shot that we see of Jerry Lewis in the film, Jerry Langford, when he's escaped the captivity, and it's running down the street and then sees all of the TVs with Rupert Pupkin on his show, finishing his act. And we see this just haunting image of a face of a man that, everyone knows, like just one of the most famous faces, iconic faces ever, that represents a very specific type of humor and professionalism. And watching that face looking at this, unearned mediocrity and unearned success on TV, it's just really haunting, this kind of passing of the guard of Jerry Lewis's type of entertainer with a capital E, like consummate professional, to this new sort of whatever it is, like unearned stardom, flash in the pan stardom. And of course that's complicated a little bit by the casting of Sandra Bernhard in this film, because Sandra Bernhard is playing a crazy person, but as a person cast in this film, she is also emblematic of this really interesting, new, dynamic type of humor that is much more deserving, infinitely more deserving than anything that Rupert Pupkin has to offer. So it's a kind of complicated narrative, but I'm so glad you brought up that theme of the metatextuality of the actors who were cast in this film, because it really just takes this to a whole other level if you understand who these people are and what they really bring, the history that they bring to their roles.
Yeah, there's a whole school of film scholarship and criticism called star theory that I've mentioned before, which basically is based on the idea that when we see a movie star in a movie, not an actor whose name you might know, but a movie star who has a full body of public texts available, meaning not only their roles in movies, but interviews in magazines and appearances on talk shows and blah, 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 to the extent that we feel like we know something about what they're like. When one of those stars gets cast in a part and we watch that movie, we are bringing our knowledge of all of that, of the entirety of the person, what we think is our knowledge of the entirety of the person, of at least of their public persona, to our reading of that, to our viewing of that and our engagement with that. So, you know, when people are watching this movie, for example, people are watching this movie and they know Robert De Niro very well from his collaborations with Martin Scorsese, and they know he played Travis Bickle. Are we reading Rupert Pupkin as a bit more menacing than we might if he were played by a different actor at that time? You know, that's definitely something that would have been a consideration at the time. And the same with Jerry Lewis, along the lines of what we've been talking about. So it's an area that's I've always found very interesting, and I think it definitely comes into play here. So I'm glad that that was brought up. Liz, you have a question or comment?
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to, I was looking at the fact that in one of the articles I read, they mentioned that relatives of Scorsese were in that, like a whole bunch of people. And one guy who played a technician at the TV show, he looked like a younger Martin Scorsese. And I thought it was kind of ironic about a movie like this that's talking about a person trying to glom on to another person's fame and take it for themselves, should have the Scorsese family in it. And also, I also found it interesting that coming after all this, you know, about fame and latching on to famous people, were the 90s, where you became famous just for being you, with reality TV. It just is kind of an ironic thing that happened.
No, that's true. And Martin Scorsese, I'll be honest, I hadn't thought about your view of it. Hadn't occurred to me that there is something about fame and connections in Scorsese putting these people in his movies. He's often put his mother in his movies, and of course his mother was the voice of Rupert's mother. We never see her, so that makes it harder for us to believe or be certain that she's real. Thank you very much for putting that brainworm in my head, Lisa. But I think the other folks, but you're right. I think Scorsese's sister was in there. I think his father was in there. Maybe someone else as well. I chalk that up, frankly, to the quick shooting and low budget of this. I mean, those are all people he didn't have to pay, probably. Although his mother may be in the guild because of how often she appears in the movies, but the others probably not. So I think of it more like that. And less a sort of connection, especially because other than his mother, I don't know that any of them had appeared in any other, or at least not very many other movies. Lisa, did you have any thoughts on Liz's comments?
The technician at the shooting studio was probably Marty himself. He does have a cameo in it. So
the director.
Yeah. If you thought he looks like a younger Martin Scorsese, that's because it was a younger Martin Scorsese. Circa 1983 Scorsese.
Yeah, the TV director who's going over the last minute things before the final episode is filmed. Yeah, that is Scorsese. So Martin Scorsese. So yeah, that and he was in Taxi Driver too. He's someone who took a ride in Travis Bickle's cab. So yeah, he does that. I mean, a lot of directors do that. Hitchcock's the most famous, but a lot of directors do that. And I sort of give them a pass, especially when they cast themselves as a director, because it's probably much easier for them to just do that than to explain it to an actor as to how to be that way. But yeah, no, a lot of Scorsese family members in this movie, far more than usual in my experience. Well, it looks like we are done with questions. So I will just simply ask, before I ask Lisa if she has any last points or remarks she wanted to make about this film, I would just sort of announce last call for questions and comments from folks. Oh, Matt is, oh, a couple more. Okay. Yeah, Matt did mention he might have a follow-up. Matt, what's your follow-up?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I didn't want to raise my hand at first. I want to leave time for others, but since there's extra time, I'll raise this other point, which is along with the theme about people trying to latch on to famous people as a way of catching fame. I think this film is of a piece with a whole list of other films about people, so to speak, on the bottom rung of the ladder, just trying to make it by scratching their way up as best they can. And in fact, one of the movies is on a very similar theme, and it's based on a book by Nathaniel West from, I think, the 1930s called Day of the Locust, which is all about fame in Hollywood and how the movie goers would latch on to their favorite movie stars and trying to just have some of their fame rub off. It's a scary kind of a movie because of the out of control crowds that gather in that story. And then there's a whole series, another one that involves show business in a way is a film from the early 80s with Tom Hanks and Sally Field's, Punchline, where they play stand-up comics trying to make it by going to open mic sessions at different comedy clubs in the city they're in. And a wonderful, wonderful movie where actually neither of them plays a very funny character, although they both play stand-up comedians. But if you've not seen that film, it's a similar but different theme with nobody in that film is demented the way Rupert is in this film. And then 3 films that have to do more with salesmen, just trying to scrap their way up the ladder to success in business sales. Glengarry, Glenn Ross, The Tin Men, and Big Kahuna, which if people are interested or are not familiar with those films, I'll provide a little more detail. But they're all films about these people who are just down on their luck, really at the bottom of the heap, trying to scrape their way up just 1 or 2 rungs up the ladder to have some modicum of success in a very different field from showbiz.
Well, Matt, I think you've identified what sort of ties these films together. I think there is an important element that separates them out, and we can think about the extent to which what I'm about to say applies to this movie, which is there are people who are doing what you're saying, sort of trying to get, to capture, a subsistence level of success, of income, or a modicum of success in their field or what have you. And there are people who are doing that in legitimate fields legitimately, and there are people who are doing it in legitimate fields illegitimately. I mean, Glengarry Glen Ross, which I love, it's written by David Mamet, I love it. Those guys are all sketchy. That's pretty much all the work they do is pretty much a scam. I mean, they are hard luck men, and they are no better off. Some of them are no better off than the people they are trying to take advantage of. Some of them are worse off than the people they're trying to take advantage of. They're still trying to take advantage of them. And I think it's interesting because, this movie, I think on the one hand, it's about show business, which is unorthodox in all sorts of ways. But Jerry Lewis says to Rupert during that initial conversation in the limo, he says, it's a crazy business, but it's still a business, and there are certain sort of rules, and one of them is you start at the bottom. And Rupert's like, yeah, I am at the bottom. And he just sort of doesn't get that he's not supposed to sort of climb the ladder in one fell swoop. He's supposed to do it sort of, bit by bit, and people tell him how to do it. And, it doesn't seem to me, I mean, one of the things that's missing in this movie, and I don't mean missing like it's an inadequacy, I mean, it's missing like it would it would explain things and give us a fuller sense of sort of how off his rocker Rupert is has he ever tried to do any of the things that the people are genuinely telling him in a, to get him out of their hair, but it's actually, I'm telling this so you'll go away, but it also happens to be true sort of thing to try out. None of us, I don't think any of us thinks he has. And I don't think any of us thinks that, he seems to have this keen understanding of how show business works, except for the part that will require his time and work. And that to me, makes this different than other stories about, people in showbiz who are doing the things they're supposed to be doing and still having no success, or salesmen who are selling honest products honestly and still having no success, or things like that. And that's not a criticism of your point. There are definitely things that tie those movies together, but there are also some differences that I think will impact how we feel about those characters and the extent to which some of us might say whether they're just how similar they are. Lisa, did you have anything on those points?
I've been like nodding enthusiastically the entire time that Andrew has been speaking, because the thing about Rupert is that he wants all the fame and thinks he is owed the fame, but doesn't want to actually do any of the work. Like Jerry, when he's wedged himself in the limo and Jerry is actually giving him advice, and when his assistant is actually giving Rupert advice, like Andrew said, he doesn't want to hear it. The narcissism of Rupert Pupkin knows no bounds, and he believes that he is owed success because he has so fully embodied the surface of what success looks like to him on the television screen. And I think that is an important differentiating factor between, like Andrew was saying, between this movie and some others. One movie that I always kind of tangentially think of when I think of the King of Comedy is one of my all-time favorite Coen Brothers films, Inside Llewyn Davis, because it's about genius. Like, Llewyn Davis, he works and he puts in the time, but he doesn't have that genius that Bob Dylan, for example, does. Rupert doesn't have genius, and he's not even worried. He's not even trying to work at it. Like, what I love so much about that ending monologue, there are many things I love about his monologue. And I think Andrew said this earlier, it's fine. Like, yeah, he could probably be a middling stand-up comedian if he actually put in the work, but he doesn't have what Jerry Langford does. One thing I love about Jerry Lewis's performance of Jerry Langford is that he's so blank and kind of like just grim and humdrum most of the time we see him, and I do think the film is asserting that is because of the drain of fame, the drain of everyone's kind of expectations and desires to have a piece of him. But I also think it's because he is also just as single-minded in his craft. Like, we don't really see him in the film being this entertainer that's the host of the Jerry Langford show. But you better believe that I'm sure in that hour he is on, and he is excellent, and he has that kind of genius. And then the rest of the time that he is alive, he just kind of waits for that next hour where he's on again. So I appreciate all the films you brought into the conversation, but I do think the differentiating factor is that Rupert is such a narcissist and such an arrested person that he isn't willing to put in the work to even try to elevate his mediocre stand-up.
I mean, Rupert doesn't even really seem interested in comedy or in being funny as much as he's interested in being a celebrity comedian, like a world famous comedian, and having that sort of status and position in society. But even Joker, I mean, when nobody will take Arthur Fleck seriously, and nobody wants to give him a more prestigious job as an entertainer, he takes this, really, it seems like a really pretty cruddy job, being this clown, but at least it's his opportunity to perform and his opportunity to bring smiles to people's faces. Something, he obviously goes off the rails with his determination to do that, but at least he's doing what he can, because that's something he wants to be an entertainer. He's very interested in entertaining. I don't get, it doesn't seem like Rupert's that. He just wants to sort of like have that life without even doing the thing or being really that interested, all that interested in the thing that got Langford there. Ken, you have a comment or question?
Yes, this is actually, I think, the third time I've seen this, and I didn't even get all the way through it. The last time was actually at a film course at Bryn Mawr with Paul Wright, who did a Scorsese course. So we've had a lot of similar discussion. But before I watched it this time, I went on YouTube and found a Siskel and Ebert review of it, obviously from many years back. And it was interesting that Siskel's comment was, he said it was difficult to watch in the beginning because most of the characters are not really likable. You have nothing you can relate to about them. But that once he did get into it, he really enjoyed it and thought it was very good. And Ebert said he really didn't like it at all. In fact, he wondered what was going on. He had to watch it a second time because he thought he missed something. So it sounds like it was not well received, as you said, by the critics too. To me, the movie that this reminded me of a lot, which was, I don't think most people may have thought of it as a lightweight, but if I have the title right, it was a Robin Williams movie called 12-Hour Photo. Is that the right name? Do you know?
I think it's 1 Hour Photo.
Oh, it was a 1 Hour Photo?
Yeah.
And it was the whole concept, though, of someone that their fantasy, here his fantasy, just the way I really agree with what you said, his fantasy wasn't so much to be a comedian, it was to be able to go on TV and schmooze with Jerry Lewis and to just be one of the guys who can hang around, like you said, a superstar. And in the same way, Robin Williams' fantasy was just to be part of a family, just to sit there and have lunch and be an uncle to the kids. And it was nothing nefarious. And I think that's a very interesting concept, that people aspire to different things, whether it's rich and famous or just, and in both of these cases, I think they just wanted to be accepted by a group.
Mm-hmm.
And that this was whether it was the show business group or the family group. And I think the other funny thing, and Lisa mentioned it too, his name itself, it's almost in the vernacular. I occasionally I've heard in conversations people say, oh, he's a Rupert Pupkin, meaning he's a wannabe who wants to get in. That the name has kind of transcended the movie.
It has. Thanks, Ken. Those are really interesting points. I particularly thought what you had to say about the comparison to a movie like 1 Hour Photo, where there's a lifestyle or a life situation or somewhere that someone wants to get, and they know what the normal channels are, right? I mean, we all know what the normal channels are. It's just that to them seems just unbelievably hard. So it's much easier to kidnap the talk show host or, stalk the family in that case or whatever. And, it's just, we're never gonna, people who aren't like that will never understand people who are like that. A much milder version of this was when I would teach college, and the students would go through these elaborate ruses to come up with excuses and occurrences as to why they didn't do an assignment, when I can't possibly imagine that taking the assignment was going to take more time than the elaborate, Rube Goldberg-esque, ruse they've constructed. But, I went to school for like a million years to do what I do. So obviously I was not ever that willing to evade schoolwork. And I guess some people are, and I'll never understand that. And it's the same thing here. But it's always interesting because we are interested in people who have lives very different from us. And in some cases, they're different for dark reasons, like the movies we've been talking about. Lisa, did you have anything to add?
Ken, I loved your comments. I also would like your friend group, if your friend group is actively using Rupert Pupkin to describe people, that sounds like a good friend group to have. I also like the comparison to 1 Hour Photo, even though it's been a long time since I've seen it. But one thing that I'll kind of add in this, Andrew said, not going through the proper channels to get what you desire. One thing that I personally still kind of find perplexing when I think about the King of Comedy is just how much Rupert is aware of his fantasies. Like, he, in the limo, at the very beginning, he said to Jerry Langford, "Oh, you can't imagine how many times I've had this conversation in my head." And so what fascinates me about his character is that he is aware of this line between fantasy and reality, but where does that line fall for him? Like, I come down on thinking that he is actually extraordinarily cunning. I mean, not so cunning that he can't get out of this single-minded obsessiveness over Jerry Langford, but I think that he doesn't actually believe that Jerry Langford has invited him and Rita to his house. I think that he is cunning enough that he is weaponizing embarrassment. He's aware enough of himself that he is forcing a series of events on a quote unquote normal person, like Jerry. I guess he's not super normal, but I think you know what I mean. He's weaponizing the embarrassment that bringing this lovely girl to a house would cause, and I mean, he clearly overplayed his hand, but I think this happens throughout the film where he isn't fully believing something that isn't true. He's trying very cunningly to make his fantasy real, and I still kind of puzzle with that. But all of this comes back to he's not going through the proper societally sanctioned channels to get what he wants.
But I think you're right, and I think it's far more interesting that he's not like 100% buying his own delusion. He like sort of knows he has to fake it a bit or push it over the finish line a bit, which makes his character more interesting and also less sympathetic. So yeah, that's an interesting way to point it out. Amy and Jeff, you have a comment or question?
Hi, yes, it's Amy. Thank
Hi.
you for this film. We were really glad to watch it. My question is about Lisa. You mentioned in the beginning you thought his mother might have been imaginary, and I don't know if I missed it and you explained why, but I thought I got a lot of the imaginary scenes, and I understood it, but I did not think that with his mother. And particularly, I thought he would be somebody who might be living with his mother, because I don't know how he earns a living, and that he might have needed to be home in perhaps the house he grew up in because he didn't have somewhere else to be. So I was wondering if I may have missed something in the film that made you think that, or, and I apologize if you did describe that earlier in this session.
Not at all. That was me playing with Andrew. Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, she was just trying to mess with me. She just pulled the rug out from my what I thought was my understanding about this movie right before we went live with the discussion. So she was just having a little fun but I think you're right, Amy. What you said, and I think Lisa would agree with this, is that the movie, though it doesn't make it as obvious as some movies, the movie does tend to make it clear what is fantasy, with a possible exception of the end. But I think even that there are some signs. What I will say in response to my own point I just made is that we never see the mother. He doesn't seem to feel the need to rewind his tape he's making to edit out her calling to him and his yelling back at her while he's making his tape. We don't hear comments from either the people who listen to his tape about his mother. So, I think there might be a shred there to hang one's hat on that she's not real, but also I guess it's possible to reconcile the mother we hear in the movie with the mother he talks about in his stand-up routine, but I find that difficult as well. So I'm not sure, but I think what you said, Amy, carries a lot of weight, that how else is he supporting himself? And he does seem like the type. I mean, it's a cliche now, but he does seem like the type who would live in his parents' basement at 34. So, yeah, I think that Lisa was probably just messing with me, but let's hear it from her herself.
I was just messing with Andrew. But I mean, as Andrew pointed out, in Rupert's stand-up, he says, if I saw my mom, I'd say to her, "Ma, why are you here? You've been dead 9 years." So, excuse me, I don't have the sort of comic timing that Rupert Pupkin did on that. But he's clearly mining his past that he cannot get out of for this middling stand-up routine. That being said, I mean, I do not think that he is hearing voices. I think his mom is alive and is supporting him, and he lives in her basement. But it was just a fun thing to inject in the beginning of the conversation.
Thank you. I'll know that for future discussions then. Thank you.
Thank you. Liz, you have another question or comment? Liz?
Am I there?
Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering about that sequence, which I can't tell whether that was, I think it was real that they went to his house, but when they were in his house and afterwards, when he walked in golf clothes holding a club, his staff was there, and their what they did with the Asian member of the staff was to sort of poke fun at him. And recently we've all been aware of anti-Asian sort of feelings among some in society. And it just struck me as really weird. I thought it might have to do with the fact that Jerry Lewis in his movies made fun of Asians sometimes himself.
I mean, I think it's a stereotype. I've seen in a number of Hollywood movies, particularly from the 80s and earlier, of the Asian or Asian American butler or manservant or whatever one might call them. I don't know. I don't have such staff at my estate. But I think that's a stereotype. And I think that, poking fun at such characters, or in Hollywood movies, people of such backgrounds, in the ways this movie did, still rudely and inoffensively, but relatively gently, certainly more gentle than Hollywood movies did in the 60s, is an unfortunate byproduct of a past time. But thankfully, it wasn't a major element of the movie. But yeah, one worth noting, absolutely. Lisa, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I didn't. I'll have to revisit the scene because I don't remember any instance of kind of deliberately poking fun at the butler. I'll have to revisit that scene.
I think he criticizes him. Jerry Lewis criticizes him and picks on him a little bit, but to me, it was the way that Jerry Langford, if not actually Jerry Lewis, would do that to anyone who worked for him. I mean, we sort of got the sense he was a stern taskmaster as a boss, both at his business and at home as well. So I didn't think of it as being directed at him specifically because having to do with his Asian identity, as much as I thought. But the fact that Hollywood movies, you do see a lot of Asian American men cast in those roles, so that in and of itself is kind of a stereotype, not one of the more notable or egregious ones in Hollywood history, but one that still is worth noting. But yeah, I wouldn't have equated Lewis's sort of abruptness and criticism of the characters having to do with him being Asian. But like you say, I would have to see it again to be sure. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for this discussion of the King of Comedy. And I'm sure you all join me in thanking Lisa for suggesting it and making her wonderful introduction. So thank you, Lisa.
My pleasure.
As you can see, we have some more of our Tuesday night seminars on the books. One coming up next week with Paul Wright about Breaking Bad, and I am offering one on April 20th about the Oscars, both the history of the Oscars and a little bit about what will be different this year. And we'll have some more for the coming months to announce before too long. But check those out in the meantime. If you are interested in learning more about film, we have a lot more resources on our website, including our Ask Andrew segments, mini film lessons, all sorts of film-related puzzles and other things. You can check those all out in the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. And if you want to look at new movies we have that you can only stream virtually through your local theater, check out our Theater 5 section, either through brynmarfilm.org or theater5.org. We are open for private theater rentals, and if you saw our Saturday email, you know that before too long we will have an announcement about opening on a wider scale. But if you didn't see that, it's because you don't get our emails. So sign up for our emails. And every Thursday, you will get a link to the introduction for the following Monday's discussion. And you will learn what the film is and a whole bunch of other great education stuff. And we have a lot of great resources and opportunities for entertainment and engagement that come in our emails throughout the week. So consider signing up for them at brynmarfilm.org. And lastly, if you have the means to offer some additional support to BMFI during this challenging time for organizations like ours and for so many of us in general, please consider doing so. We would greatly appreciate it. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody, have a good week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.